Okay, that's us. No swearing. We are live. The only swearing must be done by myself. Um, thanks for joining us for the first week of the Omega course. The original Omega course I set up it must be 20 years ago now, and it was playfully in opposition to the Alpha course. The Alpha course started in the 1970s, and over 12 weeks, they would look at questions of, does God exist? Who is Jesus? Is the Bible reliable? These kind of questions. But what was interesting about it is it was around a table like this, and there was food, there was coffee or wine. But at the end of every session, there was usually the right answer, how you should really think about Jesus. And the original Omega course was designed to explore alternative ideas. It was to say that basically within Christianity, there's multiple ways of thinking about these questions. And actually, the history of Christianity and all religions really is a history of discussion, sometimes passionate, sometimes violent, sometimes polite, but a conversation with multiple views on the table. And what we think of as orthodoxy is often just part of a conversation, and it's kind of what we've got after that conversation. Come on in. It's like I'm having visitors. Hello, come in. You might be on. Oh, you got the worst seat in the house, I'm afraid. There's no backing to it. So we wanted to explore that idea of conversation in the Omega course, doing the same questions, but looking at Jesus from, for example, a conservative perspective, a liberal perspective, looking at Jesus from a perspective outside of the church, have a conversation, and instead of landing on the right answer, having an interesting conversation that would hopefully be kind of enlightening. This is not what we're doing here. This is because the other thing about the Alpha course is that it tried to articulate what every church believes. Ultimately, not the differences, but what is shared in common. And so in a sense, it does give an accurate description of what you see in most actually existing churches today. However, there is a different type of understanding of Christianity that goes under the name religionless Christianity. So if Alpha course is about kind of a religious Christianity, which is basically there's a set of beliefs, a way of looking at the world, a way of thinking about God, a way of thinking about humanity, of Jesus, of the Bible. And no, it's a lot more than that. It's not saying that that's all religious Christianity is, but belief is a big part of that. There's a story that we affirm. Then religionless Christianity is slightly different. One of the versions of it is less to do with belief and more to do with a way of being in the world, a way of life. Bonhoeffer was actually the first person to use the term religionless Christianity. Somebody may have used it before, but he was the one who really coined the term in his letters and papers from prison. And he coined it because he felt that religion basically defined God as an object in the world that we interacted with. Just like other objects in the world, like the best object in the world, God's not just a regular thing, a regular person. God's like the best. But God's still kind of much like another person or thing in the world. And we pray to that God. We believe things about that God. We try to maybe live in line with how that God wants us to live. But for Bonhoeffer, this understanding of God, while useful and at a time made sense to a lot of people, for Bonhoeffer, he felt that we were living in a time when this notion of God made less and less sense to people. Now, that in and of itself is neither here nor there, but he actually thought that it might not even be necessary to Christianity, so it makes less and less sense to people. Perhaps it's actually something that we can take off like a garment, and we can understand Christianity in a different way that doesn't require this understanding of God, that ultimately could be actually a destructive notion of God. And we'll talk about that in a second. And the interesting thing about what Bonhoeffer was doing is he wasn't adding something to Christianity. He wasn't adding an additional belief. He was taking something away. So religion-less Christianity is obviously you're taking religion away. So this isn't kind of like him adding. Same with Luther. Luther wasn't trying to add things to Christianity. He was trying to strip away what he felt were additions that actually kind of hid the true scandal and the true liberation of the Christian message. Indulgences, for example. This was something that he felt wasn't, required. And of course, circumcision was the first question the church had to argue about whether this was required for salvation. And eventually the church said, no, we can get rid of that. That actually gets in the way of the real message. And so Bonhoeffer's saying, perhaps this religious notion of God is getting in the way. And for him, this religious notion of God was the God who gives us an answer to the question of life. We look at the world and we don't understand what's happening. God's the answer, whether it's crops failing, somebody getting sick, why the sun rises, God is the answer. Or God is what we believe in because we're scared, and we're scared of death, we're scared of meaninglessness, we're afraid of that this is it. And so God becomes something that we hold on to that helps us feel, okay, my life is meaningful. And Bonhoeffer felt this was kind of God always coming in at the weak points in life, the points when things aren't working, or when we're scared, or when we don't have the answer. And he was talking about, well, what would a religion look like where this notion of God is in the center of life, not at the edges of life, not always in our weakness. And he died before he was killed, before he got a chance to really explore what this might look like. So Bonhoeffer sits at the beginning of this course as the person who coined this term, who said, well, maybe there's a different way of thinking of faith. And for him, it was giving oneself to the world. So when you read Letters and Papers from Prison, Bonhoeffer is saying, forget about God as a being. Forget about God as some object that's out there that you pray to in the closet. Get out there and embrace the world. Embrace the world and enjoy it. Embrace the world and try to fight against injustice. Give yourself to those who are struggling. Get alongside issues of justice. Give yourself to the task of making the world a better place. But he didn't stop there, because then you could say, well, that's a kind of form of humanism, which is great. But Bonhoeffer says, but actually, no, what you'll do when you do that is you'll find you're actually in the heart of God. And you're actually affirming a deeper sense of what that word means. So in the very act of giving up God and giving yourself to the world and enjoying life and helping, kind of embracing existence in an open way, you will find yourself returning to or finding the very thing that you thought you lost. And then he dies. So we're left with these little fragments, and we're like, wow, this is interesting. Beautiful words like religion is Christianity, giving oneself to the world. Worldly Christianity is another term he had for it. But he's executed. But Tillich isn't. Tillich continues on. Tillich continues after the Second World War to write theology. And in some ways, I think he provides a way of understanding what Bonhoeffer is doing when he talks about religion as Christianity. So now I'm going to talk about Paul Tillich, and then there'll be a chance for some question and discussion. Paul Tillich had a way of doing theology called correlationism, where he would take a question. He would look firstly at what is the question of human existence? What is the problem that we face as people? So he would really study human being, what it means to be a human, and find out what dilemmas that creates. And then he would look at Christianity and see how it responded to those questions. And so this is correlational theology, because he would correlate the human questions with kind of theological answers. And some people have, critiqued him for that. People like Karl Barth weren't a big fan of that. They don't think you should start with the human. They want to start with the proclamation of the gospel, But Paul Tillich took very seriously what it means to be a human being, a finite being. And that's where he's at his best, by the way, personally, for me, is Paul Tillich is brilliant at describing not what our everyday problems are. Like, I don't have a good gin in the house or something. But he's brilliant at describing what the human existential universal problems are. So before I get to the reading, I want to talk about what he thinks the human condition entails. So he's doing traditional philosophy at this point. He's very clear. If you want to read good philosophy, Paul Tillich is actually a great person to read. He really understands Heidegger. He understands Sartre. He understands the medieval scholastic tradition incredibly well. And in philosophy, one of the most basic questions is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all? Why not nothing? And if you're interested in that question, that weird, bizarre question, then you'll find philosophy very interesting, because it really starts there. And another question that's quite tied with that is, what is stuff? What is this something that exists? Okay, so what is it? Why is there something rather than nothing, and what is it? Okay. Heidegger addresses this, and he says that if we want to ask what stuff is, what things are, let's start with ourselves, because we are something. We are a thing. So we have a privileged access to ourselves. We think, we reflect, we can ask that question. In fact, as far as we know, we are the only things in the universe, as far as we know. I'm sure there's lots of other things, but in this world, we're the only thing that asks, what does it mean to be? What is stuff? Why is it here? You don't see dogs and cats, getting very existentially distressed over these kinds of questions. So we can start with ourselves. And Paul Tillich says, okay, we start here. What are we? And he says, well, this sounds so bizarre when you're doing philosophy. It's so basic. He says, there has to be a subject and object to ask that question. When you ask, what am I? There's someone who's asking the question, the subject, and you're asking a question, which is the object, the thing you're asking the question. What am I? What is stuff? So he said the very first thing about humans is there's a subject and object distinction. You experience yourself as a subject, and you postulate questions, or you postulate a world. So at a very basic level, the thing that we are is a subject-object distinction. We have a centered self and stuff that's not that center. And it's very hard to disagree with that, because as soon as you disagree with it, you're kind of implicitly agreeing with it. Because if you say, I disagree with that, you are disagreeing with that. You, the subject, are disagreeing with this proposition. So, what is that? What relevance does that have to anything? Well, for a start, that there's a sense of distinction has appeared in the world, a sense of brokenness between subject and object, whether it's an illusion or however you want to describe it. There's some sort of difference there, and it means that we oscillate between various polarities. I'm going to mention the three that Tillich talks about. He says we oscillate between individuality and participation. So we are individuals, but we are in a world. We participate in a world. We're not apart from a world. We speak a language. We have a culture. We have a tradition. So we are worlded in Heidegger's terms. And our worlds are different. If you're in a prison, one's a prisoner, one's a prison guard. They have the same environment, but they experience the world in a very different way. So we are worlded and we're individual. So we're between these two poles. We're also between the poles of what Tillich calls dynamism and form. Form is the stuff that we are, your body, yourself, your form, your thingness. And dynamism is your possibilities, the fact that you're changing, the fact that you're making decisions, that you're not the same thing yesterday as you are today, that people change. If you were just pure form, that you'd just be an object. Pure dynamism would be like those subatomic particles that are in superposition until they're crunched into a position. You'd be pure potential, but no form, right? That's just an analogy. But you can't have both. You're kind of both. You're a form and you've got potential. You're in movement. And then finally, he talks about freedom and destiny. As human beings, we are caught between these two poles of freedom. And by freedom, what he means is the ability to make decisions, to deliberate, to decide, and to take responsibility for your life. So, and he means it in a strong sense. We don't make decisions very often in our lives. It's at a point when really all of us, who we are in psychoanalysis, there's a superego, and it's often telling us what to do. It might be the dead mother or something telling you should wash the dishes or whatever. And we're broken up. But there's a point sometimes in our lives when we're resolute, when we make a decision. And it's not someone else's decision. It kind of feels like it comes from us. So it means freedom. But destiny means all of the things that influence that decision, all of the causality. Your memories, your history, your unconscious desires, your conscious desires, everything that kind of dictates what decision you're going to make. We live in kind of in the tension of those two things, free and yet like constrained by our destiny. And then even more than that, as human beings, we are haunted by non-being. So we experience ourselves as existing, but we know that we didn't exist once and that we may not exist in the future. That death is all around us. It bookends our lives. It's there. It's all around us. So that's another distinction: being and non-being. We are beings who experience non-being or who are unsettled by it. This is what the word anxiety means. It causes anxiety. Anxiety is fear of nothingness. Fear is fear of something. Anxiety is fear of nothing or the nothing. And that's very key for Tillich. Anxiety is a universal human phenomenon for Tillich. You might not have anxiety issues, anxiety problems, but anxiety is still something that really marks us as potential. You may not always feel it, but there will be times in your life when that anxiety arises because non-being is a reality that we face. And then he says as well, we are finite and we are confronted by the infinite. So we know that we have a start and a finish, that we're finite beings, but we have this conception then of something that is infinite, something that doesn't have finitude, and it's not us. So that's disturbing. It's kind of like being in nothingness again. It's like, we realize that we can't have everything. We can't be everywhere. We are limited. Ultimately, it's like, Kierkegaard says it like this: if you choose to get married, you're going to regret it. If you choose to stay single, you're going to regret it. If you choose that job, you're going to regret not taking that job. If you take that job, you're going to regret not taking that job. If you stay at home, you're going to regret it. If you move out, you're going to regret it. Right? So when Kierkegaard says this, he's talking about a form of life in which the grass is always greener on the other side. That literally every decision you make wipes out countless other decisions. As soon as you crunch your potentiality into one position, you've wiped out so many others. And that's anxiety producing. We're finite, we're in one place and one time. So that's the human condition for Paul Tillich at a very basic level. Wherever you live in the world, as creatures of language, you live between individualization, participation, between being and non-being, finitude and infinitude. And he has an interesting thought about the arguments for the existence of God, where he says, The arguments for the existence of God, which are traditionally the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. So there's cosmological is, there are finite things with cause and effect. This created that, that created that, that created that. And then the argument goes, well, you can't go back infinitely. There must be a first cause that got everything moving. And then there's other versions, which is like, teleological argument that is, well, there's the argument of movement. Everything's moving, so there must be like a first mover to have got everything in movement, like someone who have flicked the dominoes to get everything moving. All of these arguments, Tillich says, are good in their first half. All of the questions they bring up something very human. We're finite. We have movement. We are caused by other things, not ourselves. We are not our own cause. And he says that's the strength of the arguments, not where they lead to, because they then postulate the existence of God as an object, a being who's out there who is responsible for all of this. And he says they just don't work. And if you study philosophy, you realize, even if you like the arguments, they don't kind of work as philosophical arguments. But he says Tillich says they do work in describing what it means to be human. And he says the important thing is that the question of God arises. That's what the arguments for the existence of God prove. They prove that people ask the question of God. So again, he's kind of smart. He's saying, yeah, the arguments work in the sense of like it shows that we feel ourselves finite and we're trying to find an answer to that finite thing. It says as long as you take the arguments as that, they're perfect. Just don't get caught up in where they lead. Because for Tillich, if you start thinking of God as an object, he says, then God becomes just one other thing in the world, one other object in the world that you're distant from, that you're separated from. That could never heal you or fix you or anything. It's just like exactly the same as saying that if you have enough money, if you have the best car, if you're going out with the right person, then you'll be happy. God as an object postulates something out there that if you can get to know that person, everything will be fine. And Tillich says, no. What we need to do is reconnect with the ground of being. So not go up out there, God is a stranger out in the world that we can meet, but rather God is the name he gives to that out of which everything arises. Subject-object distinctions, us as human beings, everything that arises out of this ground. And so to return to that ground, which is the human dilemma, how do we return to this ground and connect with it, participate with it? And so for Tillich, it's not to do with anything to do with arguments. It's not to do with religion. It's nothing to do with that at all. It's to do with ultimate concern. The way to reconnect with this ground of being, and by the way, he says this ground of being doesn't exist. He says existence is the wrong word to use. And he says it's a problem for theologians should be very careful to not talk about God as existing. Because to exist is to stand out, to be something that you can touch, you can maybe taste or smell or see. Existing is a type of standing out. And he says God is the ground out of which everything that exists arises. So in a sense, you can say God exists, but only by analogy, because God is not less than existence. Because existence comes out of God, but in a sense, God is more than existence. But one other thing I didn't say, by the way, which is very important, is I was making distinctions. Another human distinction we have is between essence and existence. An essence is like a circle. A perfect circle is a shape where every point is equidistant from the center. But there is no perfect circle. Every circle you look at, if you analyze it closely enough, will be less than that. So existing circles are never perfect circles. So the essence is kind of like the perfect circle, but you can never find a perfect circle. Whenever we as human beings say, oh, I wish I'd been nicer, or I could have done that better. We're kind of assuming a type of essence. We're falling short of something. To be human is to experience yourself as somehow falling short of some sort of ideal, that we're not connecting with our essence. That was another thing that's important for Tillich, that we experience as human beings. But if we have an ultimate concern, what that means is we connect with something concrete in the world. So God is not an object that you love. You love objects. You love things in the world. And in that love, you find God. So God is not an object that you love. God is that which you discover in the act of love itself. So in ultimate concern, something in your life becomes incredibly significant, overwhelmingly significant. You see this from the beginning, from kids who will not eat their Brussels sprouts, right? And it's not just that they won't eat their Brussels sprouts; it's that they no matter what happens, they will not eat them. There's somebody who would not. It's not really told me a story. Would not eat their vegetables.
Well, my dad.
Your dad, yes, yeah.
Yes, sat in his motor for 24 hours. He wouldn't eat a boiled egg.
Yes. Boiled egg. It was a boiled egg.
Mean parenting, but anyway.
Mean parenting, but it was sat supposedly, so the myth goes, for 24 hours. Who knows? It maybe felt like 24 hours more than beef, but supposedly sat there for 24 hours and wouldn't eat the egg. That's ultimate concern. I mean, that's like, you're putting your whole being in the refusal to eat the egg. That's like, it's not sensible, it's not reasonable, it's ultimate concern. And we see this obviously in great Russian literature about love affairs or whatever, that there are times where people put some person or some cause above everything else, above their own self-interests. That thing becomes more important than everything else. So for Tillich, this is kind of, this is fulfilling. In ultimate concern, these polarities that we talked about kind of dissolve away. So, for example, you participate fully in something, but in that full participation, you feel more like a self, like an individual. You feel more alive. You give yourself to a form, something that exists, like a religious position. You give yourself to that, and as you give yourself to it, you innovate within it. Sometimes people ask me, like, when did I leave, Christianity, or when did I leave my charismatic or evangelical tradition? And I never felt that I left it. I felt like I was so committed to it that it kind of like I went deeper and deeper in, and then it kind of opened up new possibilities. It's like a great artist. Often a great artist is just painting the same type of paintings as their masters, right? But they're painting it, and then in the repetition, something new arises. They're trying to be faithful, but in their fidelity, something new arises. You can see Jesus as potentially being faithful to Judaism, being absolutely unconditionally faithful to the tradition of the day. And in that, there's a dynamism, a creation of something new arises. For destiny, you choose something that, in a sense, chooses you. You free, like, that's what falling in love can feel like, where you feel like it chose you, but you choose to choose it. You choose to enter into this. So in this embrace of ultimate concern, these distinctions that cause us anxiety in our lives begin to dissolve away, and we can feel this profound sense of oneness. We connect with, in a sense, that which we're estranged from. However, and that's why, by the way, in the reading, Tillich talks about centered decisions. He's saying that the act of ultimate concern is it kind of is your whole body. You give your whole self to a decision. You don't just go by in life and go from one thing to another. You don't do things because other people are telling you to, and just go with the flow. There's a certain point when you resolutely, with your entire kind of conscious and unconscious self, just your whole will, your emotions, and your rationality, they all come together, and you decide on something. You decide on something that feels like it's decided for you, and you give yourself to this. And that's faith. However, Tillich then says, of course, there's two types of faith. There's demonic faith, and there's, a true faith. He says a demonic faith is when you give your ultimate concern to something that is not ultimate. You give something ultimate concern, which is a preliminary kind of question. It is not an ultimate thing. It's finite. And for him, National Socialism was the example, where he said that basically Hitler is a type of, I suppose, in one sense, a type of Messiah, right? A type of Antichrist, a type of false Messiah. In that, who doesn't have a fascination with the Second World War? Like, in my documentaries on Netflix about Hitler, Hitler continues to have this interesting, perverse kind of fascination for so many of us, because there is this resoluteness to fascism. You see it in these massive demonstrations. You see this participation, full participation in a cause it's stirring. You see those documentaries by Leni Riefenstahl. Yeah, that's her name. I'm pronouncing it correctly. Yes. That are like these profound kind of commitment to. Soil and blood is not the fascist thing, but it's like Hitler looks like their ultimate concern, but it's demonic ultimate concern. It's raising state and nation, something that's not ultimate, to the realm of the ultimate. And ultimately that is utterly destructive to other people and utterly destructive to oneself. When you raise something that is not ultimate to the level of the ultimate, it never ultimately can satisfy. And so, people get more and more fanatical. They start blaming other communities for the problems. They find other ways to try to avoid the confrontation with the fact that this isn't working, this ultimate concern isn't working. But it is a form of ultimate concern, a form of passion. He also called it the unbroken myth. It's a type of mythology, a type of story that tells you who you are, what's right or wrong, what's good and what's bad, but it's unbroken, it's literal. You think that the words describe reality, and you will destroy people for the sake of it. You will destroy others for the sake of your ultimate concern. Now, for Tillich, theology, that's all theology is about. It's about studying ultimate concern. That's what it is. It's not every other concern is about other things: biology, anthropology, physics. They're all different concerns. The only concern that concerns theologians and theology in the church is ultimate concern. What concerns us ultimately, and what happens when we're in this state of ultimate concern. The question of faith. And he says, the opposite of idolatrous faith is not indifference. Indifference is, terrible for Tillich. Indifference is where you just kind of like, it's really depression, to be honest, where you don't really desire anything at all. You lock yourself away in your own being. You don't care about anything. And you just waste away. And ultimate concern still exists as a potential that's never realized. The alternative is just as passionate as the demonic form of ultimate concern, but it connects with the ground of being. It basically takes your, say, religious position, and it looks at it symbolically. You have beliefs, you have a position, but it doesn't literally define who you are and what you're about. It is the symbolism that helps you reconnect with that which grounds all of life. This is probably what Tillich would say Jesus is kind of hinting at when he says, he says humanity was not made for the law was made for humanity, which means if your faith, if your politics is destroying people, then it's idolatrous. You're trying to fit people into your ultimate concern. But actually, if you treat your faith and your belief in a symbolic way, it is the means by which you touch the invisible. It's the means by which you become sensitive to a love for all things. It's your way of becoming more at one with everything, reconnecting with other people, with the environment, reconnecting with the ground of being. So you have to have something you commit to. But that is the window that opens you up to a much more humane kind of way of living. So yes, by the way, there are questions and thoughts. Is anybody on Terry, or what was your name again?
Katie.
Katie, can you see any questions there? If I would take a second. Oh, Katie, you look on your side. It's just,
So
There's two are older.
Yeah, those are. What's
Oh, there's only 3 questions there.
For church history.
Oh, what else is there?
And this one says, can there be a theology after the death of God? When God dies, does not humanity die with God, or at least the notion of humanity embedded within that theological paradigm?
Oh wow. Okay, that's a good question. Okay, well, I mean, yes, this is go. Yeah, this is probably not answering that question as such, but it's kind of saying that this is what Paul Tillich is trying to do. I mean, he's developing a theology that is not about, say, certain belief or worldview. It's theology as a way of keeping things symbolic. I think that's what Paul Tillich is saying. So he's saying that Christianity as a religion exists, and what theology is trying to do is to make sure that tradition, it's not to abolish it. It's not to abolish your narrative. It's not to talk. In fact, he says, talk about God as living, God as creative, God as powerful, infinite, eternal. All of this is fine. But he says it's to remember that this is a symbolic language. And by symbolic, he's always fighting against people who say, oh, you mean just symbolic? He's going, no, it's not just symbolic. Symbolic is bigger and better and richer than literal language. This is Tillich, Tillich's language. He says the problem with literalism is you're talking about, for example, a literal person rising from the dead, for example, which is of no real interest to anybody, right? If there was a documentary on TV about some guy rising from the dead in in Austin, I wouldn't care. I mean, I might watch it if it was Tuesday night. If it was a Friday night, I'm not going to sit in and watch about some guy who was died, pronounced dead 3 days later in the hospital. He's back around again. That is no bad. That's nothing except for good dinner conversation. Did you hear about the crazy guy who was dead for a few days? That's literal kind of talk. Whereas Tillich said symbolic discourse is discourse in which allows you to participate in what you're speaking of, like poetry. It's a kind of discourse that actually allows you to enter into something which is beyond the words. I mean, John McMarion talks about it as iconic language. Idolatrous language is language which reduces things. Iconic language is, because an icon is something visible that brings you into the invisible. So when you look at an icon, technically the idea is that you don't get so caught up in the visual image, but it draws you into an experience of the saintliness of the saint. It kind of draws you into the invisible. It radiates the transcendent. But even if you do want a very mystical language, even works of art can be thought of like this. There's the physical work of art, but then there's a sense in which the art opens up worlds. It opens up experiences whenever you participate in it. And so for Tillich, he's saying theology is symbolic language. And so the point is not to get rid of it. Don't get out of your church. You should if it's really bad, right? Yeah, of course, sometimes you have to leave. Some relationships are really bad, you have to leave. Whatever, some churches are really bad, you have to leave. But don't leave because the language suddenly is like you're saying God above, and you're suddenly going, but God is not above. We don't live in a 3-tier universe anymore. God, that you kind of, what you can do for Tillich is he says, well, you can understand that when you say God is above, you're not talking about literally, in the sky or in the universe. In fact, we live in a universe where there is no up, right? You understand that, but you then say, oh, this is a way of saying the transcendent. God is transcendent, transcends all our intellectual understanding, transcends our experience. Every time I name God, I say less than God because God is above. It's a symbolic discourse. And he wants to say that then the church can survive and faith traditions survive, not by changing what they believe, but how the belief functions. And the important thing is, when you embrace that, the what will change over time. some symbols will lose their power and other symbols will become more powerful. Some symbols, like, even things like kingdom of God, I mean, sometimes that kind of language of kingdom doesn't make any sense to some of us now. We haven't lived in places where there are kings for, centuries or whatever. So suddenly it's like kingdom of God. What does that mean? The Republic of God might become a symbol, so these are constantly changing. But yeah, Tillich is very key and very concerned in saying that our language doesn't die. We all have mythology. He calls it myth. Again, this language is problematic because when we hear words like myth and symbol, they can sound very negative. Tillich, when he talks about myth, isn't talking about something that's false. He's talking about the stories that we tell ourselves or that are told to us that help place us and help us understand, our place in the universe. And we need to engage symbolically with those. And he sees this as actually the core message, one of the core messages of Christianity itself. Was there anything else there coming up that questions?
So there's another question by Adam. Could you expand on Tillich's statement that serious doubt is confirmation of faith?
Oh, yes, we didn't even get to that, yes. That's good. Because the thing about the Tillich saying here is saying that doubts and risk are now inherently part of faith. So if your ultimate concern is in an unbroken myth in Tillich's language, if you raise to the ultimate something that is not ultimate, then you've got something that is literally true. There's no doubt or unknown. You've got the right answer. There's no risk. I'm right. Everyone else is wrong. Now, of course, it's very hard to maintain that. One of the things Tillich says is that there comes a point in our lives when someone challenges what we believe or we challenge ourselves. And when that happens, we can either go with it or we can repress. So someone questions my faith. I've basically got a choice. I listen to the critique and I start to go, okay, you've got a point. Never thought of that. And I start to rethink. Or I go, oh, I don't like this. I'm freaking out. I'm scared. I don't like where this is going. And I repress and I push the doubters away. And actually, I think you see this a lot in all religions and none. But if you have a church where everybody's obsessed with apologetics and everybody's obsessed with kind of like evidence that demands a verdict, often that's not evidence that they're certain of their faith. It's evidence that there's doubt and unknowing, which is being pushed down. And so the response is reading lots of apologetics. If you're confident in your faith, you don't need to read every volume of Josh McDowell, And also in those communities, sometimes if someone asks questions, they are then pushed to the sides or even pushed out. But not because the questions it's not because the other person is questioning them. It's that they are questioning themselves and they don't want to see that. And the other person is bringing out those questions, bringing up the questions that already exist within them. And so they have to push them away. So Tillich says, in one sense, there's a good fundamentalism for Tillich, which is kind of in a sense, okay, you haven't questioned your beliefs, whatever they are, you haven't questioned them. Fair enough, who cares? That's great. We're all been there. But then it becomes negative fundamentalism when once you've been questioned in a way that makes sense to you, you don't respond to those questions. You hide them, you push them away, you get rid of them. That's the problem. The problem is this regressive fundamentalism. There's lots of people here probably fundamentalists because they've lived all their lives in a community that hasn't really seriously questioned things. And actually, if they were in an environment where someone they respected asked some serious questions, they might go with it. That's totally fine, but not the other kind. And why was that? Oh, yes, so doubt. So once you get to the point where you have a broken story, where your faith is symbolic, then there's inherently risk and there's inherently doubt, because the symbols might end up being destructive to someone. They may end up, the thing that you've given yourself to might end up not working, whether it's a relationship, a cause, and basically you have to take that into yourself. This is the courage that Tillich talks about, and he thinks this courage comes from God, from the ground of being. But he says that to be human is to have faith in a non-demonic sense, is to realize that this icon, whatever you're giving yourself to, that's symbolically helping you touch the unspeakable, the transcendent, that as finite might fall short, might end up being racist or sexist or whatever, and yeah, I have to change it. You might end up in a place that you don't want to be, et cetera, et cetera. There's no protection from that. There's just no protection from it. So it's basic. It's just like love. Like the first time I said this morning in the church, so apologies to the couple of people who were there, but when you're in love for the first time, you might think, God made this happen. You are the one for me. There is only one person in the world for me, and it's you. And if I hadn't met you, it's weird that I'm saying this to me, by the way, because there's a big image of me on the computer. So I was like, if I hadn't met you, my life would be incomplete. But now that I know you, but you're saying, like, you're the one. History has written it in the stars. You're the fulfillment of all the prophecies of my life, right? But then as you get older and you realize that things are difficult and not all love lasts and relationships break down, you can try to protect yourself. You can try to run away from that, try not to love again. But Tillich is saying that, part of being human is to have the courage to, give that ultimate concern to a person or a cause. And what the alternative is now is you do it exactly the same way as you did when you were, 14 or whatever, exactly the same way. But this time you still say the same things. You're the one, but it's symbolic. So you're also simultaneously going, that things could have been different, and that it might not work out, and that there's a risk and that you have to work hard. And even if you do work hard, it might not work. And that a lot of relationships end in the deepest types of bitterness and anger, and where people do the most horrific things to one another and each other, sometimes because of the hurt. And all of that. You bring it into yourself and you still say, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try. And that's the courage that Paul Tillich is talking about in faith. Any questions around the table, by the way? Thoughts, comments?
I think I'm interested in the unbroken myth versus the broken myth idea. I think this morning at the Sunday service, you talked about, so we all inherit a myth, and then we have an experience in our life that might break the myth. And then if we choose to repress it, then we keep going on the unbroken myth. But then if we invite that in, we begin living with the broken myth. I'm trying to get the question part. There's no question part.
That was a good summary, by the way. So
okay, but then that would also be regressive faith, is that right? Or negative fundamentalism, as you just explained it.
If you repress the doubt and continue with the unbroken myth,
yeah.
Yes, that's kind of like what we often call fundamentalism today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just keeping going with that unbroken myth.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is that your question?
Yeah. That seemed like a really helpful thought in my mind.
That's right. I think it's in chapter 2, I think, of the dynamics of faith. I thought it was brilliant when I read it. I was like, okay, because again, Tillich is saying, no, don't judge somebody who like has this level of certainty that's maybe naive. Because if you sit down with them, you might just find that, as I say, they just haven't been in a position to really think about it. He says that the dangerous type of fundamentalism is the fundamentalism that knows the myth is broken but refuses to acknowledge it. So that's what God is speaking. That sounds scary.
I tried to access the questions through the app,
but okay. Something very weird just happened there. I don't know if anyone heard that. Wow. But yeah, so he's saying, and Zizek talks about this. So in psychoanalysis, it's the idea of you know something, but you don't want to know that you know it. That's what it is. So suddenly, okay, you know that what you believe has cracks, has fractures, has problems, but because you haven't got to a point where you're able to embrace the doubt and the risk, you protect yourself from it. And by the way, like for sometimes legitimate reasons, none of us want to take the risk sometimes. But yeah, that's the problem for Tillich.
And getting a little bit more controversial, that could also be like conservative and liberal as well. Is that right? Like conservative wants to keep the unbroken myth, and maybe liberal is okay with exploring the doubt a little bit more.
It could be, although I mean, historically, different groups will be better at it, but that can change. So in one sense, I don't know if this is true, but I know this bit's true, but I don't know why it's true. You're Americans, you'll be able to tell me. But the Republican Party was the anti-slavery party. It was this progressive party more, and so I don't know whether that meant that was for political reasons or whether it was for moral. It was political reasons. You think, okay, yeah, might not be a good example, but it's kind of like saying that at a given point. It might be more liberals, more conservatives, but technically Tillich's saying actually it's not really about worldview at all. You could find a very conservative church in Arkansas that would be very healthy and wouldn't use this language, and actually might dislike this language because this language would be so foreign, but they kind of like live it. So for example, they say, we believe every word of the Bible is completely true. But like, if you talk to any of them individually, they kind of really believe it, you know. They kind of like, and there's actually been studies done on this. I wish I could remember them, but I talked to somebody who was part of a sociological study, and they found that when they interviewed individuals in some of these fundamentalist churches, they would very plainly say things like, "Oh yeah, all the Bible is equally true. Like God doesn't lie." And then they would, in next week in youth group or whatever, talk about, well, is there any times where you feel God has lied or changed God's mind? And they're very happy with playing the kind of the differences between God never changes, God changes, you know, God hears everything, God doesn't hear everything, God's a warrior, God's a peacemaker. And they're kind of okay with that kind of symbolism. But and then you could find a liberal community that is incredibly harsh, and if you don't, you know, and you see, to be honest, you see some of this on Twitter, where, you know, people get burned, you know, through kind of like, you know, kind of some leftist or liberal kind of position, but has itself become a form of idolatry. So for Tillich, he wants to say, yeah, this is more of a how than a what.
So even for an idea like social justice, that could take on a demonic form or a pure form, depending on the
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes, it could take on a demonic form. Yeah. Any other questions coming up?
I've missed a few. But,
oh yeah.
And they told me they couldn't hear when I said the question, so.
Yes, you can repeat them.
Yes, if you could.
Oh, I can repeat them.
Could you expand on Tillich's notion of the holy? Did you guys hear that?
Can you expand on Tillich's notion of the holy? Okay, yes. I actually was reading, because I've been reading a lot of Tillich for this, more than I should have, and I'm trying to remember what he said about the holy. I'm sure.
Somebody who mentioned this, so if you scroll up, maybe that would prompt about holy discontent.
Oh, that might be something different.
I've heard it say the ultimate concern as holy discontent. Is that something?
I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that. But it does have the word holy in it. But go ahead. There you go. These guys are working hard for their gin. I think Tillich will say something more profound than this, so this isn't the answer. But I do know that you know, he would see something like the word holy as a good symbolic word for this idea of transcendent and otherness, because holiness means he does go against the pietistic understanding of holiness, you know, like doing the right thing or whatever. And he says that holy is about the holy other. It's a word that is attempting to protect God from becoming idolatrous, from God becoming something that is an object like other objects. So I think that's kind of his understanding of holiness. Is not to do with piety or anything like that. It's another way to protect the divine. And this is happening all through the Bible. Like, you've got hundreds of names for God that don't all fit together. You know, warrior, peacemaker, and you know, God who used to say, hears cries of people, God who's deaf, God who never changes, God who changes. There's different names and different notions of God that are playing against each other. And then there's the unnameable God. There's a tetragrammaton, the unsayable word. And both of these are are strategies of protection. You know, someone like Eckhart would say this, that the unspeakable is not, what do you say, like God is not, the unspeakable is omnispeakable. I think that's the way he says it. It's basically that you can't say something. That doesn't mean you go silent. Kind of means that you say loads of stuff and it doesn't quite fit together. And that's part of the protection. So to protect something from being like literal, you can go silent, like the unnameable God, tetragrammaton, you can't even say the word. There's a brilliant reminder not to idolatrize this. But then here's 100 different names and they all smash together in complex ways. That's another great way to avoid idolatry. And even the idea there's 4 gospels is a fascinating thing, that they don't all fit together neatly. There's lots of stories that don't fit. In one of the Gospels, in one of the Synoptic Gospels, the clearing of the temple is at the end. Is it John? The clearing of the temple is at the beginning. I can't remember. Oh my goodness, we can edit this bit out. Yeah, it's terrible. I'm trying to think. John would have the clearing of the temple at the beginning, because that's not why Jesus dies. Jesus dies because he's God. So that's logically, that would be the case, which means the Synoptic Gospels would have it at the end. That's what I'm working out as logic. I'm probably wrong, but the Synoptic Gospels are much more about Jesus as a warrior and fighting for stuff, and that's why he's killed. And John's much more about, it's because he says he's God. But do you have 2 clearings of the temple? Do you just have one? Is it? And one church father, Tashi, and he tried to put them all together and make one uber gospel, and they called it heresy, because they're like, that's not, the point is there's 4 kind of competing things to almost keep things open. These are 4 testimonies that ultimately can't describe what they're testifying to. This is the idea of a trauma. If someone's been traumatized by an event and they can't give a clear description of what happened, that's evidence of the trauma. If they can give a very clear description of what happened and the dates and the times, it's more likely to not be true, because, by definition, if something traumatic happens, you're overwhelmed, and so your times and dates aren't clear in your head, Yes. Any other thoughts from around the table, or from, I can zip up and down here, by the way. Is there anything good?
Did Tillich have any kind of background in psychoanalysis?
He did. Well, he liked psychoanalysis. He read Freud and he read Jung, and he had a powerful insight into their work, and so it's in there. That's one of the reasons, again, why I like Tillich, is he kind of has an understanding of the psychoanalytic thing and the existential. Like, it's actually hard for me to do this for the main reason that I keep wanting to slip into the other thinkers. I want to kind of make Tillich into Sartre or into Heidegger or into Freud, and I can't do that because he's not quite them, and I'm a little bit more comfortable with them. So, for example, Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, he has something that's very similar to Tillich, where he says, like, imagine a young guy who wants to go to war to fight the Germans, Second World War, but he also has a mother at home who's elderly, needs help, and he's trying to decide what is the right thing to do. Go and fight in the war, which is to be a very small part of something very, very big, or stay at home and look after his elderly mother, which is to be a very big part, of something small, not world historical, something small. And for Sartre, the big thing is that this kid is running around trying to get advice from everyone. It's like phoning up your friends asking, should I go out with this person or should I not, or whatever. You're trying to get advice from everyone because you don't want to take responsibility yourself. You don't want to take responsibility for the act. And Sartre is saying, you have to. There's actually no way of nailing this, what you should do. Even if you find an ethical theory that allows you to make the decision, you can't ground that ethical theory. So ultimately what you've got to do is take that decision, resolutely give yourself to it, with the risk that it completely doesn't work, right? But in being resolute and making that decision and really kind of deciding with your whole being, that then he says you're acknowledging your freedom. He has another example. He has lots of good example, Sarah, but where a man reaches over across a table in a restaurant. Sartre's always looking. It'd be great. He's always looking at people to see how he can kind of expose them and have a good example. So we see. I think he actually sees this. A guy reaches over to this woman. He squeezes her hand, and Sartre watches to see what will happen as a result. And he says, "Well, will the woman squeeze the hand back?" Which is a way of saying, I like you, right? Or will she remove her hand? Which is a way of saying, you're not the one, right? But he's watching to see what will happen. But then he says, but this lady just lets her hand lie limp, neither squeezing it nor pulling it away. So she's not being resolute in her freedom. She's like, I don't know which to do. So I will just like let it lie limp and let things just play out and see how they go. So Sartre's going, no, if you want to really experience life, it's very difficult, but it's about resolute decision making. And so Tillich is kind of saying that. But Sartre doesn't kind of bring God into it, whereas Tillich kind of does in some way. I guess the only difference maybe is Tillich says the courage is what comes from the ground of being, the courage to live and the courage to make resolute decisions. We've got a couple more minutes. Don't want to take loads of your time, but we've got a little. Well, what time did we start? 2:00. Yeah, it's okay. We've got a few more minutes.
So,
is it John? Someone's trying to help me out. Thank you. It is John. Oh, look at that. You see, this works sometimes.
So I guess we'll go with the most recent one.
Go with
Does
the
that
most
work?
recent one,
Okay.
if you think.
With America being a country who celebrates the literal, how can we break these constructs?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I'd be honest, but it's like, I mean, Europe, my goodness, we've got some problems there. Go to Northern Ireland if you want to see crazy politics. I mean, I'm sitting there having a laugh at Donald Trump, like, and then I remember who's running our country. And I kind of okay, yeah, we had the.
Yeah, but in some ways, well, not worse, but some of the things you're like, would Donald Trump get away with doing that? Probably not.
No, yeah.
And we're fine.
Yeah. I mean, we had a health minister who was a creationist and wouldn't let.
You've got a suspended prison sentence for having abortions.
Yeah, it's crazy. We got lots of crazy stuff going on. So, yeah, this is almost, and for Paul Tillich, I mean, he was living in Nazi Germany where he was seeing this idolatrous form like exploding everywhere. So there probably are historic epochs and times when it's worse and times when it's better. And yeah, potentially we're living here in a time that's not good.
I have a question about unbroken myths and broken myths.
And does it connect with that then, Farron?
Okay, so it's kind of about American literalism and stuff and how potentially we have to turn it away. A situation potentially where certain people is like pushed in the corner, or people who have potentially more educated or have had the opportunity to have their myth broken, kind of look down on the people who have this unbroken myth or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we potentially, I don't know, break a myth for groups of people without doing it in a threatening way? Because that seems to be a problem that there's in Europe as well. There are groups of people who are really pushed into a corner, and potentially more liberal people, whatever, look down upon them and stuff like that, but it's not, and it's a real moral judgment rather than an awareness or whatever. So how do you
that's key. Because, okay, so the question, I don't know if you heard that, you probably did, but Helen's saying, how do you potentially help to break these stories, these myths, either like in politics and countries or with individuals? And that's actually, I'm passionate about that, because that's ultimately, if you want to know what my work is, that's my job. That is my job in communities, to try to help very subtly kind of break the unbroken myths. And that's what I try. And that's why I use loads of parables, use loads of storytelling. But the first thing I say to people in relation to that, and I think it's key, if you can do this, you're doing well, is you first have to understand how much you do want a broken myth. You have to understand how much you don't like doubt and risk, that you want the answers, that you've often pursued finite things as the infinite, that you've often run away from your responsibilities in life. And that allows you to become much more sensitive to other people who are doing it, when you realize, yeah, my goodness, of course, you don't want to kind of like look at that stuff because it's painful, it's difficult. Like in psychoanalysis, if the analyst doesn't have a lot of patience and grace, really grace for the person they're working with, it doesn't work. And the reason why they have it is because they've done psychoanalysis themselves. The one thing a psychoanalyst has to do is do psychoanalysis. They have to do years and years and years of it, partly so that they can see how messed up they are and become more sensitive to, you know, the struggles that the other person's having. So that's one. The second thing, which is very key to the Tillich stuff about unbroken fundamentalism, is that most kind of unbroken myths, most communities that we experience that have this literalism, actually already have doubts and questioning going on in them. Most of them aren't naive. Like this is not, if you're living in America and you've been around a bit, most of it's not naive. So most of it's regressive. Most of it's repressed. So that means, but that's difficult, but that also makes your job easier. You do not have to convince anybody that their story is broken. They already know it, right? So you don't have to convince them. You don't have to convince someone to doubt, to ask questions. That's already going on in them, but in a place that they haven't been able to really access or let be. So what you have to do is be generous and gracious. Sometimes, not all the time. If someone's a real asshole, you know, whatever. But you know, but generally, to graciously find what indirect communication. What can you say that allows them to simply bring up to the surface what's already going on? You know, so for example, you know, racism against, say, Mexicans, whatever, taking our jobs, or whatever. You know, that might be about actually poverty, lack of education, problems within a community, and it's being misdirected. In the same way as a relationship, you come home from work and you can't shout at your boss because you'll get fired, so you shout at your partner. They don't deserve getting shouted at. That's displacement. You're taking anger that should be directed here and you're displacing it here. Sometimes people have anger, about legitimate anger about their communities and about the devastation that's happening, but the anger is being directed in the wrong location, being directed in the wrong place. And often that's kind of known, subtly known. And it's trying to find a discourse, because the worst thing to do is point out that someone's wrong. It makes you feel great, but it doesn't work. That defense mechanisms come up. As soon as you say to someone, you're an asshole, you did X, Y, and Z, they're like, I'm not an asshole, I didn't do that. Like, I and you say, look how you treat your dad. My dad's terrible. You wouldn't believe how annoying he is, right? But if you're like, oh, you're a bit stressed, you know, what's happening in your life? You thought, yeah, it's been a terrible week, and I really took it out on my dad, right? If you call me an asshole, even if I know you're right, even if I know you're right, I've got a vested interest in protecting myself, and I will protect myself. And deep down, somewhere I'll know that I'm wrong, but my defenses won't let me admit it. You have to get around the defense mechanisms, and that's the art form. And that's what I don't like about, you know, a lot of stuff I see in social media. It's like, you know, you force someone to apologize, and eventually maybe you get them to a place where they have to apologize, and then it's not enough. And then you're not really wanting people to change. You're just wanting to solidify your own position and make them feel terrible. And so that's the art. And it's different with individuals, with communities. But as I say, one final thing on that is the reason why I use parables and storytelling and comedy. I mean, you may wonder, when's Pete ever used comedy? He's never made me laugh. I will try when I speak in maybe a church, that use a bit of, you know, get people laughing. That lowers defense mechanisms. Tell a good story about Seamus. That lowers defense mechanisms. And then you kind of realize that Seamus is you. And you go, oh yeah, that's right. And you can get a lot more done. So yeah, it's how to speak indirectly. And that's why I love artists, musicians, poets, because that's what they do. Any final good ones? I hate to say final good ones. That means if I didn't get your question, it's a terrible question, but that's not true.
Someone was curious about the C.S. Lewis retreat.
Oh,
I don't know what that.
You can't ask about the C.S. Lewis retreat here, but do email me about it, because I might, do email me about that. Whoa. Oh yeah. Okay, Terry, come on, do your job. Some of you are putting questions in the chat box.
Oh.
That's not allowed. You're going to be blocked for that kind of behavior. Maybe there are just chats.
These are mostly comments so far.
Oh, comments. Okay, well, no, you're using it correctly then.
Comments.
I did see one or two questions. Ages ago.
It's-
There was a few towards the beginning, yeah.
Oh well. Okay, well, I'll just finish off then with the question came up.
It's a add-on to this question. I think. No? Courage needed while doubting?
There's been a lot of questions about.
Oh, doubt and courage. Oh yeah, well, I don't know if I think I mentioned the courage thing, but just briefly, yes, to have doubt and to have risk requires courage. And that's what the courage to be is, and that's partly as well as helping people access that courage to tell people it's going to be okay. Like when I did Atheism for Lent, which was, so much fun. We had many people involved in that. It's incredible. But when I've done it in person, one of the things you want to say is you do want to say to people, it's all going to be okay. That's a lie. You don't know if it's all going to be okay. You don't know if they're going to believe the same thing at the end as at the beginning. If I say that, I'm lying. In the same way that a therapist can't say it's all going to be good at the end of therapy. It might not be. It might be terrible. Who knows? But you've got to be a non-anxious presence and say to someone, listen, I'm there with you, and I'm doing this or I've done this. And so you're a non-anxious presence that doesn't promise anything, and that can help people find the courage. So they go, okay, I'm gonna go with this. But it's like a lot of us, we're afraid. We're afraid that if we start questioning things, we're going to lose our job, we're going to lose our friends, we're going to, lose our family. And these are like not idle. I meet people all the time who have lost their jobs because they've questioned. They've lost their families because they've seriously questioned. It is very, very risky. And you can't, it's terrible to promise that, that it'll all be okay. The only thing I'm trying to do, I had this idea for a tour where I would go around the country and I would do it was an altar call, right? So it'd be an altar call tour. And everyone would bow their heads at the end. And I would kind of go like, who here has doubts and questions about their faith, and who actually thinks that that's a positive part of their faith and their life journey? Hopefully some hands go up. They usually do, because if they're coming to hear me, that's great. But then then the altar call bit is going, okay, I have a declaration of doubt here. I want you to sign this, especially if you're a church leader involved in the church in some way. And we're going to publish this in some papers, and we're going to try and get like thousands of signatures. Because if one person says, I embrace the symbolic, I embrace the brokenness of the discourse, I think it's good, you get fired. But if 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 come out and say it together, you can make changes. This is what's happening today with Pride. Pride is like one or two people, saying they're gay in an environment that's homophobic. They just get fired. But when people gather together and say, listen, we're all coming out, you can't fire us all. Now, the problem is, some people will still get fired and get beaten up, and some ministers will still get fired. And you've got to say that. And if I ever did this tour, you'd have to do the disclaimer. If you sign this, you might get fired. But that's the risk. And do you want to take that risk? If you want to take that risk, come forward. Because actually the original altar call wasn't for salvation. It was to sign the anti-slavery bill. So, the original, come to the front, raise a hand, come to the front. It was nothing to do with salvation. Salvation was what you did on your seat. And then the evidence that you were saved was come to the front and sign the anti-slavery document. So this is kind of come to the front and sign the doubt document. Yeah. So risk and doubt is part of faith. So in a nutshell, what we've done is we've said the human condition is we have this sense of lack within us. We have this sense of finitude, this fear of non-being. We try to fill that in all manner of ways, and the religious God is just one of those ways. But Tillich says, instead of looking out there for some object that will fix this, we want to reconnect with the ground of being. And to reconnect with the ground of being, you can't treat it as an object because the ground isn't an object, right? So you can't treat it as an object. So you have to attach to objects, to creation, to things, to people. And as you commit to them in a symbolic way, they open up, and you, in a sense, reconnect with this ground of being. So you never directly reconnect with God. You embrace people in love, And in that embrace, you overcome this subject-object distinction. You kind of, in one sense, overcome this individual and world distinction. You feel yourself more at one. And in that, you're participating with the divine. And if you want to see a documentary that captures this, there's a documentary called Being in the World by a guy called Tao Rossolini, who, did I say his name? What's his name? Tao?
Ross Polly is his surname.
Ross Polly. I hope Ross Polly isn't watching this, because I do know him a little bit, but I can never pronounce his surname. But it's
Racist against Italians.
yes, I hate the Italians. I never eat Italian food, never. So it's just a thing. But it takes a Heideggerian thing called Being in the World, where he says, like, whenever you're a true master, something like if you're playing a guitar and you're really into it, you kind of don't feel like you're separate from the guitar. There's this place where you feel like you're one with the guitar, and they follow like a carpenter, this master carpenter, and he's saying that when he's working with the wood, he doesn't know where the wood stops and he starts. He's part of the material, part of the house that he's building. And so in a sense, Tillich says, when you give yourself an ultimate concern to something, this subject-object remains and yet also dissolves its power, its negative power, and you feel yourself at one with the ground of all things, which he calls God. Okay, ask questions on Facebook, chat, think, send me messages if you want, and I hope you got something out of that. And I'm going to see you next week, and we're all going to drink lots of nice gin. So thank you for joining us. Take care, and we're off the air. No.